What is the possibility that the majority of the Old Testament were written during and after the Babylonian exile? Short answer: it's possible that significant editing and compilation happened during and after the Babylonian exile, but unlikely that the majority of the Old Testament was first written then. Most scholars land in a hybrid model, earlier texts plus exilic, post-exilic redaction. Here's the landscape, clearly separated by probability rather than ideology. 1. The maximal exilic composition hypothesis. Most of the OT was written in exile or later. What it claims: large portions of the Torah, Deuteronomistic history, Deuteronomy Kings, and even some prophetic material were composed during or after the Babylonian exile, 6th to 5th century BCE. Earlier traditions may have existed orally, but not as stable written texts. Why some scholars argue this? Exile is when Israel needed identity reconstruction, law, history, and theology. Scribal activity clearly increased in Mesopotamian-style bureaucratic contexts. Themes of covenant failure, punishment, restoration align well with exile trauma. Problems: requires massive retrojection of historical, legal, and cultic detail. Struggles to explain pre-exilic linguistic layers in Hebrew. Cannot easily account for early prophetic books that presuppose functioning monarchies and temples. Probability assessment: moderately plausible as an explanation for final shaping. Weak as an explanation for first composition of most material. 2. The mainstream scholarly consensus. Most defensible. Pre-exilic origins plus exilic post-exilic redaction. What this says: much of the OT was written earlier, especially early legal codes, royal annals, temple liturgies, prophetic oracles. During exile and after, texts were compiled, edited for coherence, and theologically reframed, especially around covenant, exile, and hope. This model explains multiple literary styles, repetitions and themes, tensions, e.g., monarchy versus Torah emphasis, why exile theology is present without dominating everything. Widely applied to Pentateuch, layered but ancient cores, Joshua Kings, exilic redaction of earlier records, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, earlier oracles plus later shaping. Probability assessment: high. This is the position held by the majority of critical scholars today. 3. Linguistic and historical constraints, often overlooked. Hebrew language strata. Early biblical Hebrew appears in Judges, Samuel, early Psalms. Late biblical Hebrew dominates Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel. If most of the OT were written post-exile, we would expect far more late Hebrew than we actually see. Cultural memory problem. The OT preserves obscure tribal details, minor shrines, forgotten place names, archaic legal customs. These are hard to invent convincingly centuries later without earlier sources. 4. Archaeology and comparative texts. Israelite inscription, e.g., pre-exilic seals, ostraka, show writing culture existed well before exile. Ancient Near Eastern parallels, law codes, treaties, annals, match earlier OT forms, not Persian-era styles. 5. So what is the actual likelihood? Claim: OT invented wholesale during exile. Likelihood is very low. Claim: OT mostly written during exile. Likelihood low to moderate. Claim: OT compiled and edited during exile. Likelihood high. Claim: OT preserves much older written material. Likelihood high. Bottom line, with an integrated answer: the Babylonian exile was a crucible, not a factory. It is very likely that the exile shaped the Old Testament. Scribes organized, preserved, and reframed earlier texts. It is unlikely that the majority of the Old Testament was first written during or after exile. A model where Mosaic era through monarchic texts were preserved, then edited across centuries, including exile, fits the linguistic, archaeological, and literary data far better than a late invention theory. What is the plausibility of fabrication of the older portions during this time? Short answer: Large-scale fabrication of the older portions of the Old Testament during the Babylonian exile is implausible, while selective reshaping, framing, and supplementation is very plausible. Here's a disciplined breakdown of why fabrication fails as a dominant explanation and where limited invention actually could have occurred. 1. What fabrication would have to mean, clearly defined. For fabrication to explain the older portions, Genesis, Judges, early laws, early narratives, exilic scribes would have had to invent centuries of national history, create coherent tribal geographies, retroject obsolete customs accurately, imitate archaic Hebrew dialects, fool multiple independent audience, priests, elders, rival groups, suppress or overwrite all competing traditions. That is an extraordinarily high burden. 2. Linguistic implausibility, one of the strongest constraints. Biblical Hebrew shows layered chronology, not uniform late composition. If fabrication were dominant, we would expect mostly late biblical Hebrew, Persian administrative vocabulary everywhere, flattened literary style. Instead, we see early biblical Hebrew in many older texts. Archaisms no longer productive in exilic Hebrew. Poetic structures that resemble second millennium Semitic forms. This is very difficult to fake consistently without modern linguistic tools. Assessment: large-scale linguistic fabrication, low plausibility. 3. Cultural memory problem, often underestimated. The older portions preserve minor tribal disputes no longer relevant, shrines that ceased to exist long before exile, local customs with no post-exilic utility, unflattering portrayals of Israel's heroes. A fabricated national myth normally centralizes power, idealizes founders, and smooths contradictions. The Old Testament does the opposite. That is anti-mythic behavior. Assessment: fabrication that includes embarrassing, obsolete, and decentralizing data? Very unlikely. 4. Sociological constraints on scribes. Exilic scribes were educated but not sovereign, working within living communities, surrounded by elders who knew the traditions. They could edit, interpret, reframe. They could not plausibly invent Moses, invent tribal land distributions, invent long genealogies tied to real families, invent legal traditions where people were already practicing. This is a community memory check problem. Assessment: mass fabrication under social constraint, low. 5. What is plausibly invented or reshaped? This is where nuance matters. Plausible during exile, post-exile, editorial framing, theological commentary, genealogical smoothing, explanatory bridges, emphasis on covenant failure restoration, expansion of speeches or prayers. Less plausible, core narrative arcs, ancient law codes, foundational genealogies, and early cultic practices. So yes, some content was added, but not the backbone. 6. Comparative ancient Near Eastern evidence. In surrounding cultures, texts were copied, updated, and glossed. Core traditions were preserved, not reinvented. Fabrication usually left stylistic fingerprints. The OT fits the preservation with redaction model far better than the invention model. 7. Probability breakdown, plain and honest. Scenario and plausibility. Scenario: total fabrication of early OT in exile. Plausibility, very low. Scenario: majority fabrication of early narratives. Plausibility, low. Scenario: heavy editorial reshaping of older texts. Plausibility, high. Scenario: addition of interpretive layers. Plausibility, very high. Scenario: preservation of ancient written oral cores. Plausibility, high. Bottom line, integrated conclusion: the Babylonian exile was a filter, not a forge. It refined, organized, and interpreted Israel's traditions. It did not plausibly invent them wholesale. A model of deep antiquity plus long transmission plus exilic redaction explains the data with far fewer assumptions than a fabrication hypothesis. What is the plausibility that ancient myths were copied during this time? Short answer: selective influence and adaptation from ancient Near Eastern myths during the exile post-exilic period is plausible, wholesale copying is not. The evidence supports engagement and polemical reuse, not plagiarism. So here's the cleanest way to see why. 1. What copying myths could realistically mean. There are three different claims, often collapsed into one. Direct copying, lifted stories, lightly edited. Literary dependence, borrowing motifs, structures, imagery. Cultural conversation, polemic, deliberately reshaping to contradict myths. Only 2 and 3 are plausible. 1 fails on multiple restraints. So literary dependence and cultural conversation, polemic, are plausible. Direct copying fails on multiple constraints. 2. Access during the Babylonian exile. Plausible but limited. During exile, Judean elites could have encountered Babylonian creation texts, chiastic motifs, flood traditions, royal ideology embedded in myth. So exposure is plausible, but exposure does not equal copying. Babylonian myths were written in Akkadian, embedded in polytheistic ritual systems, tied to temple liturgy and state theology. This creates translation, theological, and cultural barriers. This creates translation, theological, and cultural barriers. 3. Why wholesale copying is implausible. A theological inversion problem, the biggest issue. If Genesis copied myths like Enuma Elish, we would expect multiple gods, sexualized creation, divine violence as creative force, humans created as slaves of the gods. Instead, Genesis eliminates divine genealogy, removes divine sexuality, rejects cosmic violence, grounds creation in speech and order, assigns humans dignity, not servitude. That is not copying, it is systematic contradiction. Copying normally preserves core metaphysics. Genesis destroys them. Structural mismatch. Yes, there are surface similarities. Primordial waters, chaos and order, flood motif, but structure matters more than motifs. Feature, Mesopotamian myths and Genesis. Feature, theogony. Mesopotamian myths, central. Genesis, absent. Feature, divine conflict. Mesopotamian myth, creative. Genesis, absent. Feature, moral cause of flood. Mesopotamian myth, capricious. Genesis, ethical. Feature, post-flood promise. Mesopotamian myth, none. Genesis, covenant. This is not derivative structure. Ancient authors did not copy like modern writers. In the ancient Near East, copying was explicit, colophons and named sources. Traditions were localized. Myth reuse preserved ritual function. Genesis has no ritual dependence on Babylonian cults. It removes mythic utility, and it undermines Babylonian theology. That is anti-mythic composition. 4. What is plausible? Adaptation and polemic. The most defensible model is deliberate engagement. You know these stories? Here's why they are wrong. Examples. Chaos waters exist, but are not divine. Flood happens, but for moral reasons. Kings matter, but are under the law. Creation is ordered, because God is rational, not violent. This is theological argument using shared cultural vocabulary. Think countermyth, not borrowed myth. 5. Timing, exile or earlier. Important nuance. Many of these polemical patterns predate the exile. Chaos scout imagery appears in early Hebrew poetry. Flood traditions existed long before Babylonian captivity. West Semitic cultures shared motifs centuries earlier. So even if influence exists, it is not uniquely exilic. 6. Probability assessment, clear and honest. Claim and plausibility. Claim, Genesis copied Babylonian myths verbatim. Plausibility, very low. Claim, OT authors borrowed mythic motifs. Plausibility, high. Claim, OT reworked myths polemically. Plausibility, very high. Claim, influence increased during exile. Plausibility, moderate. Claim, OT invented myths from scratch in exile. Plausibility, low. Bottom line, the Old Testament does not read like a plagiarized myth. It reads like a theological rebuttal written in a shared cultural language. The Babylonian exile likely sharpened this contrast, but the roots of the ideas are older, independent, and adversarial, not copied. Would Israelites have access to a library, such as the Library of Ashurbanipal during the Babylonian exile? Short answer, no. Israelites in the Babylonian exile would not have had access to the Library of Ashurbanipal. Longer answer, structurally, temporally, geographically, and socially implausible. Here's the clean breakdown. What the Library of Ashurbanipal actually was. The Library of Ashurbanipal was a royal Assyrian archive, not a public library, located in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, written almost entirely in Akkadian cuneiform, curated for state divination, ritual, astronomy, omens, and myth. Access was limited to court scribes, priestly specialists, and royal administrators. This was not a general knowledge repository. 2. Timeline. This alone is decisive. Ashurbanipal ruled from 668 to 631 BCE. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE. The main Babylonian exile didn't begin until 586 BCE. That means the library ceased to exist 25 years before the exile began. By the time Judeans were deported, Nineveh was a ruin. The Assyrian Empire was gone. The library was buried under rubble. This alone makes access impossible. 3. Geography and political control. Even ignoring the timeline, exiles were taken to Babylonia, not Assyria. Nineveh lay hundreds of miles north in hostile territory. Judeans were displaced subjects, not traveling scholars. There is no mechanism for transport to Nineveh, permission to access royal archives, training to read Akkadian omen literature. 4. Language and literacy barrier. Even if a Judean somehow saw the tablets, they were written in Akkadian cuneiform, required years of scribal training, used specialized genre, omen series, incantations. Hebrew scribes wrote in alphabetic Hebrew, were trained in entirely different scribal systems, had no reason to study Assyrian divinatory corpora. This is like assuming a displaced Iron Age farmer could walk into the Vatican archives and read medieval Latin codices fluently. 5. What could Israelites have encountered instead? This is where nuance matters. They could have encountered living Babylonian traditions, oral mythic motifs, public liturgical ideas, widely known flood stories. They could not have accessed archived Assyrian tablets, royal omen series, obscure mythological texts preserved only in Nineveh. So influence, if any, would be indirect and cultural, not archival. 6. Why this matters for myth copying claims. A frequent claim is Israelites copied Mesopotamian myths from the library of Ashurbanipal during exile. This fails on 5 independent constraints. The library was destroyed pre-exile. This was the wrong empire, Assyria versus Babylon. Restricted royal access. Language and scribal mismatch. No historical record of access. There is no plausible transmission pathway. Bottom line, the library of Ashurbanipal was gone before the exile. It was never accessible to foreign deportees. Israelites did not copy texts from it. Any shared motifs come from long-standing regional culture, not library use. So the probability that exiled Israelites accessed, let alone mined, the library of Ashurbanipal is effectively 0%. There was no library in Babylon? So here's the correction of the oversimplification. There were libraries and archives in Babylon, but there were nothing like the Library of Ashurbanipal, and they do not solve the myth copying claim. Here's the precise picture. 1. Did Babylon have libraries? Yes, but not a single centralized open royal myth library. Babylon had multiple small-scale archives, typically temple archives, scribal school collections, administrative record rooms, private scholarly tablet collections. These are better described as distributed archives, not a library of Babylon. 2. What kinds of texts were actually in Babylonian archives? Common and well-attested, economic records, legal contracts, land deeds, tax records, astronomical diaries, omen texts, and ritual instructions. Rare and restricted, full mythological epics, literary compositions, e.g. creation epics. When myths existed, they were not mass circulated, often preserved as school exercises, written in Akkadian cuneiform, and embedded in priestly training, not public access. 3. Comparison with the library of Ashurbanipal. This is critical. Centralized, the Babylonian archives were not. The library of Ashurbanipal was. The Babylonian archives were not royal-sponsored literary collections. The library of Ashurbanipal was. The Babylonian archives limited explicit myth preservation, and the library of Ashurbanipal had extensive preservation of explicit myths. The Babylonian archives had access for priests and scribes, but the library of Ashurbanipal was only accessed for the royal elite. The Babylonian archives had an active status during the exile, but the library of Ashurbanipal was destroyed at that time. Ashurbanipal's library was exceptional, not normal. 4. Could Judean exiles realistically access Babylonian archives? Theoretical access, very limited. Some Judeans worked as administrators, a few may have learned Akkadian, interaction with local scribes was possible. Practical constraints. Archives were not public. Scribal education took years. Myths were not causal reading. Judeans had no institutional reason to study Babylonian theology. So, administrative exposure is plausible, systematic myth study very unlikely. 5. Transmission path problem, again decisive. For copying Babylonian myths to work, we would need access to myth tablets, ability to read Akkadian fluently, motivation to preserve foreign theology, translation into Hebrew, theological inversion without traceable dependence. Each step is individually weak. Together, they collapse. 6. What did exist instead? Cultural background, not libraries. Shared elements come from long-standing West Semitic culture, oral traditions predating exile, regional flood memories, common ancient cosmology, waters, order, and land. This does not require libraries at all. So the bottom line is that Babylon had archives, not a library of Babylon. These archives were specialized, restricted, and practical, not myth repositories. Judean exiles could encounter Babylonian culture, but not systematically mine myth texts. Shared motifs are best explained by regional cultural inheritance and polemic, not archival copying. So the best answer to the implied question is, yes, Babylon had archives, but no plausible mechanism exists for Israelites to copy ancient myths from them during the exile. So how could Israelites be influenced by Babylonian culture in their writing? Israelite influence by Babylonian culture did not require libraries or copying texts. It happened through lived exposure, language contacts, and shared ancient Near Eastern conventions. Here are the realistic, historically defensible pathways. 1. Cultural immersion, the primary mechanism. The Judean exiles lived inside Babylonian cities and villages. They worked as artisans, administrators, and farmers. They heard Babylonian ideas constantly, not academically. This includes public festivals, royal propaganda, common sayings about God's order, chaos, and kingship, widely known stories, e.g. the gods sent a flood. Influence here is ambient, not textual. This is how cultures normally influence one another. 2. Language contact, Akkadian to Hebrew. Some Judeans learned Akkadian for trade or administration, encountered loanwords, idioms, and legal phrasing, absorbed conceptual vocabulary, not narratives. This explains shared legal forms, similar covenant treaty language, overlapping administrative concepts. It does not imply myth copying, just linguistic proximity. 3. Scribal conventions, not stories. Ancient scribes across the Near East shared genealogical structuring, chronological framing, formulaic openings and closings, legal and covenant formats. These are genre conventions like modern legal boilerplate. Israelite scribes adopted the forms while rejecting the theology. This is why biblical texts feel ancient Near Eastern without being Babylonian. 4. Polemic response, and this is crucial. Israelite writers often appear to be responding to Babylonian ideas, not borrowing them. Examples: Babylonian, gods emerge from chaos, fight, world forms. Genesis, God pre-exists chaos, speaks, order forms. Babylon, humans made to serve gods. Genesis, humans bear God's image and rule. This is best understood as, you live among these ideas, here is why they are wrong. That requires exposure, not copying. 5. Shared ancient worldview, older than Babylon. Many similarities are much older than the exile. Primordial waters, sacred mountains, flood traditions, divine council imagery, these existed across Canaan, Ugarit, Assyria, and Babylon. So the exile did not introduce these ideas, it recontextualized them. 6. What influence looks like in the text. What we actually observe in the Old Testament. Present. Familiar cosmic imagery. Ancient Near Eastern literary forms. Engagement with imperial ideology. Ethical reframing of common myths. Absent. Babylonian theology. Divine sexuality. Pantheon rivalries. Ritual dependence on Babylonian cults. That pattern fits interaction plus rejection, not imitation. 7. A simple analogy, modern but accurate. Imagine a community living in a Marxist state, writing a book defending free will and moral law, using familiar political language but overturning its assumptions. You would not call that copying Marx. That is exactly what Israelite writers were doing. The bottom line? Israelites were influenced by Babylonian culture through daily life, language contact, shared scribal conventions, common ancient cosmology, deliberate theological opposition. They were not mining libraries, translating myth tablets, preserving Babylonian theology. So the most accurate description is cultural engagement and polemic under imperial pressure, not myth copying. So in conclusion, the Babylonian exile did not place Israel in a vacuum, nor did it turn Israel into a passive borrower of foreign mythology. It placed a theology's self-aware people inside an imperial culture whose ideas were unavoidable but not authoritative. Influence occurred through daily life, language contact, shared scribal conventions, and public ideology, not through access to libraries or deliberate copying of mythological texts. What emerges from the evidence is not plagiarism, but engagement under pressure. Israelite writers used familiar ancient Near Eastern imagery because it was the common conceptual language of the world they inhabited. Yet they consistently emptied that imagery of its polytheistic content, inverted its assumptions, and subordinated it to a radically different version of God, humanity, morality, and history. Where Babylonian myths explain reality through divine conflict and caprice, the Hebrew texts explain it through order, ethics, covenant, and accountability. The exile functioned as a theological refining fire, not a myth factory. It sharpened Israel's articulation of beliefs that already existed, clarified points of contrast with imperial religion, and encouraged reflection on history and identity. The result is a corpus that sounds ancient Near Eastern in form, yet stands fundamentally opposed to ancient Near Eastern theology and substance. That combination is best explained by cultural proximity and conscious resistance, not by late fabrication or myth copying.